Dred Scott v Sandford is a Supreme Court case that took place from 1846 to 1857. The court ruled in favor of Sandford, denying citizenship to slaves. Dred Scott v Sandford is arguably one of the biggest screw-ups in Supreme Court history, so if you haven't heard of it, what are you doing? Anyways, if you're anything like me and had no idea what Scott v Sandford was, I'm here to give you a quick crash course on it. Basically, it's a dumb Supreme Court decision made by a racist that declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. This made it so that slaves would not be considered citizens under the Constitution. The outcome of this case had a huge impact on the political climate of the US at the time, eventually leading to the Civil War. But before I get too in-depth, let's take a step back and give some context. Dred Scott was a slave who traveled with his master from Missouri, which was a slave state, to Illinois and Wisconsin, both a free state and territory. Typically, a slave would be able to claim citizenship having moved into a free territory, although Scott wouldn't vie for freedom until long after leaving Illinois and Wisconsin. Scott's fight for freedom would come in 1846, after being denied the ability to buy his freedom from his master's wife, who had inherited them after the passing of his master. After being denied the ability to buy his freedom, Scott and his wife Harriet took the matter to court. Dred and Harriet had claimed their right to freedom on the basis of having lived in free territory. The court ruled in favor of Sandford because Taney did not consider slaves citizens. Therefore, Dred and Harriet weren't subject to the same rights as a citizen, giving them no ability to sue in court. Dred and Harriet did eventually gain their freedom, but not through the traditional court system. They were sold back to the Blow family, where they were then freed in St. Louis. Luckily for Dred Scott and his family, he was one of the most famous slaves at the time and was supported by the general public. Unfortunately, the outcomes of this case expand further beyond just Scott and his family and impacted numerous people across the U.S. With this in mind, let's take a closer look at the effects of There are a couple of reasons why myself and many others do not agree with this Supreme Court decision, but I myself have three main reasons. My first being because it further divided the North and the South. Looking at it now, it was an important piece of history that eventually led to the outlawing of slavery, but this would come at the cost of the bloodiest war in American history. Politically, it was a horrible decision that further heightened racial tensions and polarized citizens of the states. My second reason is because of the direct impact of the case, which is denied citizenship of enslaved peoples. This in turn would mean that slaves would not be protected under the Constitution and not be supported by the government. The problem of slavery has so many layers that they deserve a whole video on its own, but we'll try to stick to slavery as it relates to politics and the case of Dred Scott versus Sandford, which brings me to my third and final reason, the delayed abolition of slavery. Slavery could have ended there, but because of a certain Supreme Court justice, the eventual abolition of slavery was pushed back. I remember sitting in class one day when Professor Johnston mentioned how slavery could have ended sooner. But because of this Supreme Court ruling, the emancipation of slaves was delayed. The lecture was on Supreme Court eras, specifically the Taney era. Speaking of Taney, he's the reason this video exists at all. Thanks to him, the North and the South became further divided, enslaved people were denied citizenship, and the abolition of slavery was delayed. So those are just my thoughts on why Scott versus Sandford sucked.